I've titled this particular message out of Ecclesiastes chapter 4, Finding Contentment in a Restless World. Chuck Swindoll, in his book that references this, he's entitled chapter 4, The Lonely Whine of the Top Dog. And it's a fascinating event as we look into this, and it seems as if the world never stops wanting us to compare ourselves to everything else, that we're never to be satisfied. And we see that on a continual event. Every day we are bombarded with messages that tell us that what we have is not enough, that we need more success, we need more recognition, we need more possessions, we need more influence. And if you're on social media, you need more clicks and you need more likes. And so it goes on and on. Advertisements telling us that what we have is not enough. And they don't merely whisper it, they shout it to us. And even when we reach that goal, we purchase that thing that was supposed to bring us that success and that contentment. We find that isn't so. That isn't so, that restlessness seems to become a normal rhythm of life. And deep down inside of us, we know that there's something more. We know that we were designed for something better. We were created for something better. And so the book of Ecclesiastes, as we have begun our journey through this, is some have referred to this as the diary of a desperate journey, or the journal of a desperate journey. And we have recorded for us a diary, and I think the writer is Solomon. He is referred to as Koheleth, and I think also the preacher is a good reference to that he has recorded for us under inspiration of the Holy Spirit of God, a diary for you and for me to read so that we might know how to navigate life. This is not a diary that has a lock on it and hidden away someplace and saying, don't touch. It's open for us so that we would understand that this is the path that Solomon journeyed on himself. And if you remember a little bit of the background, Solomon was the son of David. David had brought the Jewish nation to the pinnacle of success. It was at the climax of success. He had fought a lot of battles. He had been involved in a lot of wars. He had been involved in uprisings. He had been involved in a rebellion. He had been involved in all of that. And he has brought the nation of Israel to its peak, to its zenith. They were getting tribute, they were getting money, taxes from the surrounding nations around them were coming into the coffers of the Jewish nation and into the coffers of the king. And so Solomon is the next in line that David has made next in line, and he has anointed Solomon to be king. And when Solomon was instructed, he was given instruction about the dangers that were out there for an individual who sat at the pinnacle of success. He was warned about what it would be like to live life without God. And in fact, he wrote some of those in the book of Proverbs. There are warnings that he had given in the book of Proverbs. And now we come to this section in life where I think now what he is doing, he walked through some times in which he rejected God. He put aside the map. He put aside the guidebook. He put aside the light that was to brighten his path, and decided that he was going to do it on his own. He was going to live for the moment. And as he did that, as he walked through that, he tried wealth. And he had more money than anybody else in that particular day. And really, as far as today is concerned, he would have made the Fortune 500. He tried building stuff. If I build monuments to myself so that when I walk down the street and they look out there, it's like, yeah, Solomon built that and he built that. And isn't that elaborate? And isn't that amazing what he's done? He built houses, plural. I made houses for myself. You know, you can't really live in more than one at one time. And there are some times, if you want to flee the cold weather up north, you head down south. I get that a little bit. But he had houses and houses. They were all within the Jewish nation. And so it wasn't like he was fleeing. It was just a matter of like, okay, I lived in here a month. I'm a little tired. I think I'll go to this palace. And he built gardens and parks. And it wasn't public works. It was all for him. And he was looking for, in fact, he said, I even guided my mind And I pursued pleasure, and I pursued wine, making sure that it wasn't a drunkenness, but that I would find meaning and purpose, that I would get myself right to the edge of pleasure. And he said that didn't do it either. And he tried women. That didn't do it either. And he found out that as he lived his life, focusing on life under the sun, life being lived from a horizontal perspective, that God was not part of it. Every once in a while, we find a little glimmer in this journal, because I think Solomon is writing later. He's writing looking back, but he puts a little glimmer of hope in there so that we don't despair and that we keep reading through this book. And so there's this glimmer. But then he goes back to, this is what life is like under the sun. If you are living only for the things of this world, only from the perspectives of this world, it's going to be empty. It's going to be vain. That's the term he uses, not in the sense of appearance, but an emptiness, like just smoke that's gone. And so as we hit chapter 4, we have seen some glimmers of hope in chapter 3. Now we come back to chapter 4, and there are a number of things that grab his attention. And I want to suggest for us that there are 4 specific instructions that Solomon gives to us in chapter 4 about how we find contentment in life. 4 specific instructions. If you want to follow along in a Bible, it's in the chair and rack in front of you. It's page 672. Page 672. I encourage you to bring your own or a notebook so you can mark in your Bibles or mark in your notebooks to be reminded of God's truth. So the first finding that we have about contentment, the first instruction is that we need to live with compassion. We need to live with compassion. It's found in verses 1 through 3 of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. You see, the world is full of pain and injustice and oppression. And we are called as followers of Jesus to have a vertical view of the world around us and to live with compassion. Look at verse 1. And then I looked again, or I observed. These are almost like an experiment. I observed this taking place. I looked again. I observed that all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them, and no one on their side, and the oppressor had all the power, and they had no one to comfort them. And we look at that and we see that is absolutely true. If this life is all there is, and we look around and we see oppression that is taking place, we are like Solomon. If this is all there is, if we look at it from only an under the sun perspective, forgetting, as Solomon reminded us in chapter 3, that there is a God that every single human being will one day stand before and have to give an account. If we forget that, we realize there's an oppression. And that's true. It's absolutely true. We've seen it within our own country. Slavery was oppressive. If you've been down to Charleston and you've been to the slave auctions and you read about the tragedies that occurred, it was oppression. Some years ago, I read a biography of Martin Luther King Jr., Let the Trumpet Sound. That was during the civil rights movement and the pressure toward that, and the horrendous things of how oppression within our own country took place. We see oppression of abused children. We see oppression of abused wives where a husband takes advantage of a wife. We see oppression in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust and the events that took place there. Some of you may remember the killing fields of Khmer Rouge, Cambodia era, and the oppression that I haven't been able even to read some of those things. They are so horrible. They talk about the fact of not even being able to walk across a field without stepping on a human skull. Oppression. There's oppression taking place in our world today. We read about it in Nigeria. There are certainly other countries that do the same. China and Iron Curtains and such. Christians in Nigeria, pray for your brothers and sisters because they are they're attempting to eliminate Christianity. Human trafficking, that's oppression. And so as Solomon looks around, he said, we live in a world that's oppressive. Why? Because there's sin in this world. There's sin in this world. It wasn't designed this way. Sin entered into our world. And then in verses 2 and 3, there's also this live with compassion because oppression and sadness that we find around us. Look at verse 2. In fact, this is Solomon's conclusion. If we live only from under the sun, from a horizontal perspective, so I congratulated the dead who were already dead more than the living who were still living. Why? Because they didn't have to see the oppression. You see, anyone, and especially a follower of Jesus, we ought to be sympathetic and work toward eliminating and dealing with that. And so someone who is dead, who has lived and died, is no longer experiencing that, is no longer seeing the oppression that is out there. But then he doesn't just leave it there. He goes on, verse 3, he said, but better off than the person who is dead is the one who was never alive. He never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that's been done under the sun. And there's almost a little bit of a remembrance that someone who lived and died might remember that there was oppression, but if you never existed, then you don't remember that. Now, don't misunderstand. Solomon is not promoting eliminating yourself or suicide or any of that nature. He's just saying, when I look at it from down here, it doesn't seem like it's working. It doesn't seem like there's any hope. And we are called as followers of Jesus to live with compassion. It's been the church. Yes, there are times in which the church has not done well. But there have been times in which those who are followers of Jesus have stepped in and continue to do that even to this day, to seek to eliminate to the best of their ability the particular oppression within the circle in which they have influence. You see, as followers of Jesus, Jesus looked down on the crowds and he looked with compassion because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Colossians tells us, Colossians 3, that we are those who should be clothed with compassion. If we're a follower of Jesus, dear friends, what helps to bring contentment is that we live with compassion. The second specific instruction is that we live with contentment. It's found in verses 4 through 6. And he said this is contrasting the drive for success, because the drive for success is going to leave you empty. Look at verse 4. And I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done as a result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor, and this too is vanity and striving after the sun. So he's going to give to us three different perspectives in these three verses of what work could look like. The first one is the striver. The purpose that he does is he goes to work, and this isn't a matter, we'll see that there's a validity to work. Don't misunderstand. It's God designed. But he says in this particular thing, as he views it, these are individuals who are striving, the idea being that I need to work harder, I need to climb the ladder of success, I need to get at the top because I need to do that in order to be above my neighbors. Some of you perhaps remember the song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Now, for you grammar nerds, I realize it's a double negative, but makes it a positive. I didn't write the song. And for the win, who sang it? Rolling Stones. You see, there are a lot of those kinds of songs that are written from an under the sun perspective. And so he says this is an individual just goes to work because he wants to outdo his neighbor. There was a phrase that was used, I haven't heard it so much anymore, keeping up with the Joneses. Well, it isn't just a matter of keeping up, it's doing one better, right? It isn't keeping up. Well, they may have gotten that, but I'm gonna make it one better. So that's where they are. So the striver, I'm just going to work and work and work and work so that I can do better than the people around me, and they look at me and they say, yeah, there's someone who's made it. But then there's a flip side to that, and that's found in verse 5, and it's the sluggard. It's the opposite. And it's the person who says, well, if that's not the way it should be, then the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh, not working. I'll just sit here and I won't do any work whatsoever because, obviously you just said that there's no contentment in work. That's not what he said, but that's how they're taking it. Therefore, I'll just sit in my house and I'll just sit in my house. We used to have, when our girls were younger, a song, back in the day of cassette, and we would play it as we would travel, and it was Bible verses to music. And one of them was Proverbs. There's a lion outside. There's a lion outside. What am I going to do? So the thing that comes from Proverbs is I'm not going to go to work because there's danger out there. There might be a lion in the street. It might attack me and devour me. So I don't dare get outside of my house. I guess we would say, well, there's road rage out there. You can, revive it just a little bit. And Solomon says that's not it either. That's not it either. So it's not being the striver. It's not being the sluggard. It's being content. That's verse 6. One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after the wind. You can try and grab with 2 hands, but what if you realize that you have sufficient in 1 handful? We have sufficient in 1 handful. So God calls us to meaningful work, whatever that is for you, for God's glory. That's the application of this particular statement, that contentment is a choice. There was a book that was written some years ago, Happiness is a Choice. And I think it's the wrong title. I think it's Contentment is a Choice. You and I make the determination whether or not we're going to be content. And it's not based on what we have or don't have. Contentment. God calls us to meaningful work for His glory. We are instructed to work. We're instructed to provide for our family. In fact, the Bible tells us, New Testament, if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. By the way, that's a real great motivator. For those of you parents who are raising your kids, you have found that to be true. I found it to be true. If you don't get that cleaned up, you're not eating lunch. Okay, you didn't like lunch, that's fine. No supper either. It's like, oh, okay, now we have a little bit of incentive. Now we have a little bit of incentive. So God calls us to meaningful work, but we are to live with contentment. It's not a matter of how much stuff. In fact, isn't it amazing? The more stuff we have, the more there's concern. I think it was Dobson who tells a story of going and saying, I needed to get he had young kids, and so he wanted to go buy himself outdoor play equipment, for his kids, swing set, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the people down the road had one, so you had to get one a little better. And so he puts this thing all together, and he's out there, and he's really looking at it saying, this is really great. I'm really enjoying this. And after he finally got it together, you've seen that box. It looks great on the showroom floor, but you bring it home, and it's like, that looks nothing like what I saw, and it's all flat. And so you spend the next 3 weeks putting it together. And sometimes the instructions are written in a foreign language. And sometimes they're not written as consecutively as they should. And it's like, in order to fix that, I got to take all this apart. Well, he finally got it together, and he was kind of just basking in the fact of that. And he flipped over to the last page, and it says, now, you need to tighten it every single week. He said, I've just become a slave to this thing. Or it's going to eat my kids. So live, and that doesn't mean we can't enjoy. That's not the point. But it's living with contentment. One hand. What has God given to you? Oh, I need a second. No. Contentment is a choice. There's a third specific instruction that's given to us in verses 7 to 12. Live with connection. We've been instructed to live with compassion. We've been instructed to live with contentment. And now we are being instructed to live with connection, because living for self leads to loneliness. It's interesting as he begins, he said, then I looked again, or then I turned. So you understand that there's a little change in focus at vanity that's under the sun. And in verses 7 to 8, he talks about isolation of a self-focused life. Verse 7, then I looked again at under the sun, and there was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother. Yet there was no end to all of his labors. Indeed, his eyes were never satisfied in riches, and he never asked, for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of the pleasure? This too is vanity or emptiness, as it is a grievous task. Nobody else to pass it on to, but I'm going to work. And as a result of that, he lives in isolation. I've been reading through a book by Gail Sheehy. It's a rather fascinating book. It's probably written a decade ago, and it's called New Passages. But in that, she's doing interviews with individuals at different stages of life, and what have you learned in those different stages of life? And in the section that I'm reading, it's talking about individuals, both men and women, who are in about their 50s-ish. That's a couple years ago for us. But they're in the 50s, and they've been sold this bill of goods that you just need to rise to the top, and you need to push yourself to the top. Part of that, and don't misunderstand what I'm going to say here, this is Gail Sheehy. Part of that was women, with the whole feminist thing, you got to push to the top, be the top CEO, and that's what's going to bring fulfillment to your life. And as she interviews these women, she's finding out that that is not what is bringing fulfillment. They have reached the pinnacle, they have broken the glass ceiling, and they're there, but they're very isolated. The same thing happens with men. I've climbed the ladder of success, and I find it leaning against the wrong building. Some years ago, we had, they used to do the breakfasts. The men's group used to put on it was kind of a broad spectrum. Used to put on a breakfast, and they'd invite all the leaders, community leaders, both men and women, to that. And I remember an individual from Baltimore coming up, and he had reached the pinnacle of success. He was top, he was CEO. And he said, I reached that. I isolated myself from my family. I isolated myself from all of my friends. And I ended up being successful by what the world considers to be success. And I found myself living in a one-bedroom apartment. My kids had left me and my wife had left me. And the world would say, oh, you reached success. He said, I did not. I isolated myself from the people around me to climb this ladder of success, only to find out that I'm living alone. That is not success. So we'll test your memory once again. 1 is the loneliest number there could ever be. Who did it? 3 Dog Night. I know, it's kind of a weird name. Well, we've got some weirder ones even today. But anyway. And that's what he found out. Living at the top. Isolating myself from everyone else. There's no one there. There's no companion. And I'm not satisfied. None of us are going to reach the pinnacle that Howard Hughes reached in his life. But you read the end of his story. Wealthy individual. The plywood goose and all of that other stuff that he created and designed. And yet at the very end of his life, as I recall, he's living in Chicago in a small apartment, and they are divvying out to him like not even a full egg does he get for breakfast. And he gets a little bit of this and he gets a little bit of that. They're afraid, he's almost in bubble wrap, afraid that he's going to catch some disease, and he is isolated from everybody else. His fingernails have grown to look like talons. Here's a guy at the pinnacle. He has isolated himself. Now, none of us are going to be there, but we could be in that situation. And so he says the isolation of a self-focused life in verses 7 and 8, as we are instructed about living with connection. But there are 4 benefits of being connected, of companionship, of friendship, that's found in verses 9 to 12. And so the first one we read in verse 9. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. Man, that's so true. There are times when you're working by yourself and you're thinking, okay, I'm done. This is it. Somebody else comes alongside, hey, let me help you. And you can accomplish the task. Quite a few years ago, Not smart, but, you learn. Our roof needed to be replaced at home, and I had done roofing with my father-in-law and my stepbrother, or my brother-in-law. And so it's like, oh, okay, I'll take off a week of work, and that'll be my time to replace the shingles on the roof here at the house. And I could do it in stages because of the way it was set up. And so, and about end of July, it's like, okay, I'll take my vacation. And I see a number of you, folks involved in the trade saying that's number one problem. And so I get up there and I'm tearing the roof off, off this one section. And it was hot and humid and all of that. And I'm going through Gatorade. And so I get it off. And then I start to put that section back on. I had to get off the roof by about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, or you mark it with your shoes because it's so hot. And I get that piece done, and I'm thinking, man, there's a lot left. And there were some men from church who saw my predicament and said, hey, we'll come over and help you. And they helped me tear it off, and they helped me reshingle it. And I hired it out the last time I did it done. Last year. They were the ones who kept me going. And there are individuals in your life who are keeping you going. And that you need to help keep on going. Mutual labor. Second thing is mutual encouragement. Verse 10. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls alone, where there is no other one to help him up. The picture, it's a rocky field, and as you're walking through, you could step in a hole, you could twist an ankle, you could and if you're out there all by yourself, that's a problem. And so this mutual encouragement is dealing with the spiritual. There are times in our life where it gets low, where we have gone through some significant things, significant challenges. And there are individuals who will come alongside of us and walk with us through those challenging times, those spiritual lows in our lives. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's relational. I think of that phrase, not biblical, but Steve Urkel, I've fallen and I can't get up. He didn't have anybody else there to help him. I've watched some individuals get ready to get down on the ground to do some work, and they're looking around, and I know what they're looking for. Once I get down, how am I going to get back up? Thank you, sister. So I just heard recently someone said that's why you always carry an empty 5-gallon bucket with you. It's so that when you get down, you got something to push back up. The point is, if you fall, you have someone to help you. There's a third benefit of companionship, and it's mutual encouragement when you're vulnerable. Verse 11, furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can you be warm alone? If you remember reading, and it seemed a little weird in our day, but back in the day, 1700s and whatnot, in our country, when they would travel, they'd stop at a tavern, and 2 men or more would end up in a bed together upstairs. Nothing weird going on. It's just the fact they need to stay warm because there's no heat in that room. And so there's that aspect of encouragement when we're vulnerable, when we need someone to come alongside. And fourthly, there's mutual protection, verse 12. And if one can overpower one individual who is alone, but 2 can resist him, and a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. The cord of 3 strands, the application is good, but I don't think Solomon is referring to that here. But for us as followers of Jesus, it makes sense. We often tie back the fact that it's Christ who is involved. And that's true. That's true. But Solomon is saying if two are good, 3 is even better. But this is a quote that has been used in weddings, and it makes sense. You have 2 individuals and they're binding their lives together, but if you put Jesus in the center, then you're bound by those 3 cords. That's what holds you together. The commitment you've made before Jesus Christ when you walk through those difficult times, which every single marriage will walk through. because you're two different people. You've come from two different backgrounds. Being man and woman is difference enough at times. You know, you view things from a different perspective. Maybe you've had that situation where you walked in and you asked your wife, you know, she sets out a really nice meal on the table, and you say, oh, so where'd you get the meat? Well, what's wrong with it? Is often the response. Whereas you talk to your neighbor, hey, where'd you get your lawnmower? I bought it over at Lowe's. You know, the difference in how we see things. And it can be flipped around, because I know that there are women who are much more handy with tools than there are guys, than some of their husbands, and that's okay. But the point is, we come at it from two different perspectives, and so we need Jesus to bind us together. So what's the application? As a follower of Christ, we need spiritual family. Some of you have the privilege of being involved with a Christian family, and that's great. And you have Christian support, that's great. For some of you, you don't. And God has designed that the church family be a family. It's referenced that way. We are the family of God. In fact, we are tighter than even blood should be, because we are still pursuing Christ himself. And so the relationship that we have, and when a person comes to faith, is to become part of a local church family where we can encourage each other in our journey. I find it very fascinating as we look at this as a follower of Christ being encouraged. The Apostle Paul wrote this in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 6. God, who comforts the depressed, comforted me by the coming of Titus. Do you see it? Paul is stating he was depressed. And what did God do? God sent a person, Titus. And you read through some of the letters of Paul, and God brings others, individuals, into his life. I read a statement, you know, some might, well, you know, I don't have a friend. I read a statement recently that was a good reminder. A person said, I went looking for a friend and couldn't find one. I decided to go out and be a friend, and I found friends all over the place. Proverbs speaks about the fact if we want to have friends, we need to be friendly. We need to take the steps. We need to put ourselves in that situation. If I sit at home isolated from every single person there is around me, and I don't take the steps that are necessary, that's on me. But we have responsibility to one another. And there are individuals who might be going through a difficult time, might be going through a downtime. And that's our job, to be a friend to them. Sometimes we think we're the only one who's walked through this particular event. It's like, no, there are others within our church family who have walked through that event, and that's what becomes so helpful, to know each other and understand each other's journey, each other's story. Again, it's not a prying thing. In fact, right after this, we have the opportunity to sit down and interact with one another, and hopefully some of our neighbors get to know their story and get to know each other's story a little bit deeper. Why? So that we can encourage. So God has placed within us, within the spiritual family. And lastly, the fourth specific instruction is live your life with clarity. Verses 13 through 16. And that is that fame and fortune just don't last. Fame and fortune just don't last. Look at verse 13. A poor yet wise lad, better than an old foolish king who would not listen to anybody, wouldn't take instruction. Verse 14. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. So this is a rags to riches kind of thing. This young man has now come up. He is now sitting on the throne. That king, older king who wouldn't pay attention, who wouldn't listen to anyone, is kind of being pushed out. And so here's this young man. And what I've seen, verse 15, all living under the sun, throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. You know, new always seems to be better. There is no end to all people. All who were before them, and even those who come after them, will not be happy with him, for this too is vanity and striving after the wind. You know, if we just get new, then it's going to fix it. And yet we know the fickleness of humanity. We say Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey Palm Sunday, and within 5 days they're crying out to crucify him. And so what do? Jesus, we're called to live with purpose. We don't live our lives for fame and fortune and popularity. We live our lives for the audience of one. For the audience of one. Is Christ satisfied with how I live my life? He's the one we seek to please. As we wrap it up, I encourage you to flip over to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul writes this, beginning in verse 1. And he gives to us 3 statements here that are really important. 1 Timothy, flipped just a little too far. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6. Where he says that, I'm still in chapter 1. I need chapter 6. There we go. For all of you who beat me to it, great. Here we go. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, where Paul says, but godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. What his point is there in verse 6 is the only pursuit that truly fulfills is pursuing Christ. Notice godliness. What does that mean? It's a God-centered life. What is contentment? That means that there's an inner peace regardless of the external consequences and situations in which we find ourselves, even though it may be very, very difficult. One of my brothers just this past week was diagnosed with leukemia. He's younger than I am. He was diagnosed with leukemia, and the next day they began chemo treatment. And so we're on a family thread, and so we're checking in, and he said, we're just finding the hope and the peace that God gives to be sufficient. We don't know how this journey on this life is going to end, but it's a family of godliness, and he says, we have contentment. We have contentment because God is providing that. It's an inner peace. We have this tendency to think, don't we, that if I just had, you fill in the blank, if I just had, then I'd be contented. If I just had more friends, if I just had a different house, if I just had a spouse, if I just had a different spouse, if I just had children, if I just had a different job, if I just had a better vehicle, if I was just more popular. Dear friends, stuff was never designed to fulfill that hole in our heart. That's where the godliness comes in. It's like taking one of those kids' toys and taking, some square item and trying to bang it into something that's a circle. Stuff will never do that. And so Paul writes here, the only pursuit that truly fulfills is that of godliness and contentment. That's verse 6. Secondly, he says, get the right perspective. Verse 7. For we have brought nothing into this world, so we can take nothing out of it either. We're all temporary stewards. We don't own anything. Nothing is permanent. And then lastly, the practice that frees us, verse 8. And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. It doesn't mean we don't do good work at all. In fact, we're instructed to do that. We are instructed to provide the very best, to use our hands as what God has given to us. But the point that is being made is that true contentment is not found in chasing success, but embracing God's purpose. True contentment is not chasing success, but embracing God's purpose. Godliness with contentment. Let's pray. Father, the things that we have read this morning are certainly things that we are bombarded by the world. We are told that if we just do this or try that, or we see the atrocities that are out there and the oppression that is there, you'd have called us to intervene where we're able to do that it does help in fulfilling our purpose. And God, I pray that as we go out to live our lives before you, that we are living on mission. We are living the purpose that you have created us and placed us on planet Earth. That godliness with contentment is great gain. It has eternal value. And so, Father, there are people around us that need to know that. They're chasing all kinds of things, thinking that if I just had, or if I just did, or something else, that would bring contentment. Solomon has instructed us in these 4 specific instructions on how to live our life. And so, Lord, as a church family, that we would develop and we would continue to develop the tighter relationships in order to encourage each other in our journey. Father, I pray that even as we just soon have the opportunity to connect with some community folk we trust, that we might be an encouragement to them. And so, Father, thank you that you know us and love us, and you've instructed us for how to live our lives with contentment in a restless world. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.